Welcome. You're watching Physical Activity Researcher podcast. Interviews with world-leading physical activity researchers. Welcome everyone. This will be a very useful episode for anyone interested in measurement of sedentary behavior and physical activity in children. As we are discussing our new ebook we have been writing, and we have a great guest for this episode. Our guest has done her bachelor's degree in health sciences and technology in ETH Zurich in Switzerland, and she's finishing her master's degree in biology of physical activity in University of Jyväskylä in Finland. And currently she's working as an intern at this very podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest, Ugne Kari. Welcome, Ugne.
Thank you. Hi, it's so nice to be on this podcast after listening to it for several months.
Yeah, so now you see behind the scenes how this all is being done.
Yeah.
So you have, I saw your CV and you have been in many places in Singapore, UK. Could you tell a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so my childhood took me to many places. First because of my dad's work, and then I decided to go to UK when I was 16 to go to boarding school. And I think I'm very comfortable in the international field, and hence also very comfortable in the world of science because it is also very international. And now I've been in Finland for the last few years.
Yeah, and how was being in Singapore when you were smaller?
Very hot and humid, obviously. It was rough to go as a teenager. I think not the easiest time when you're also going through many other transitions, but I've definitely gained a lot from it.
Yeah. I haven't been there. I've heard they have really good food. Is it true?
It is true, although as an 11-year-old, I shied away from a lot of it. And it was only towards the end of my time that I started exploring, and I was like, wow, this is actually amazing.
Yeah, sounds good. So we can then move to the ebook that we've been writing together. And for listeners, this will be available for free. I will tell in the end of the episode and also in the podcast description how you can get the ebook. So we could go through the ebook kind of chapter by chapter. We can go the basic overview of each chapter, and then maybe if there was some challenges writing it in some chapters, we can also predict the future a bit, that how it will probably change in 5 to 10 years as the field is moving quite fast forward. So first there's an introduction chapter. Is there anything like how did you approach this work when starting to write this ebook?
I actually wrote a review on measuring sedentary behavior during this last semester. So a lot of the information I actually took from that review, but then there was still a lot to learn about kids specifically. So it kind of starts with general information about sedentary behavior, physical activity, which is the same for kids and adults, and then moves a little bit more into children and adolescents. And for that, I also looked at other papers, at the guidelines by WHO and so on.
Yeah, and if you think it fast in a way, you can think that it's the same measuring children are just kind of smaller humans, that you just put the device in the same place and it would be same. But there is quite many things that we need to consider when working with children. I had a podcast recording with Dr. Matteo Crotti, and he said that some children start to chew the wristband if it's kind of nice chewy material. So even the materials need to be correct. You need to think, how do you encourage children, maybe adolescents don't want to wear something that doesn't fit their style. Maybe they are kind of rebellious and it's difficult to get them to measure. And also we need to think that children's patterns are different, like they move
Exactly.
sporadically, and also their sleeping positions. If we talk about small children, toddlers, they can, for example, sleep in really odd positions, or they can sit upside down. When I was a small kid, I was usually sitting upside down in the sofa. I don't know, it was more fun in that way. So I think there's actually quite many things that we need to consider when measuring
Absolutely.
these things with children. Yeah. And then it starts with the subjective methods. What did you find out? How was the subjective methods with children?
That there are certainly limitations, and most of them have to do with, especially smaller kids, can't reliably estimate their own behavior. And also, if you talk about a certain age, they also can't write.
Mm,
So there are definitely limitations there.
yeah, yeah. And I think many times with the subjective, it is important to know that if you use kind of retrospective, that you need to remember, for example, 1 week after, it's
Exactly.
much more unreliable than if you actually do it, for example, right away, that you detect movement and then you ask like, what are you doing, and right away. So but also two small children, you cannot do that. Was there anything challenging writing this subjective methods part? Was there good amount of literature available for it?
I think quite good. But as with anything, you could research for months and still not see the end of it. So it is very much also an overview, a brief introduction.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I think many times we think now that as we have objective or device based measurements, people kind of think that we shouldn't use at all subjective. But with subjective, we can really collect large samples with cost
Hmm.
effectively. So we can get much bigger participant groups. And I think it's also good to know that uh, we can also get the context of physical activity by asking. So where did you do the activity? Was it in school, in a sport club, free time, or who did you do it with? With the accelerometer, for example, we don't know these things, and also with questionnaires, we can ask about emotions or feelings related to doing certain activity, which might be very important when we think about lifelong participation in physical
Exactly.
activity. And actually, at Fibion, we have launched our Fibion My Move app, which is a questionnaire based. It's asking about activity type and emotions related to doing that. So that's something we have brought into the subjective measurements.
Hmm.
Um, how was the objective methods? How did you find writing that chapter?
That was a bit more my wheelhouse because my major is actually in biomechanics, so I'm a little bit more familiar with the uh, device-based methods. Um, yes, and then especially when it came to accelerometers, that was quite easy to write. Also because there is so much information on it out there nowadays, since it is so popular. And as we
Mm,
already mentioned before, like with kids, they move so sporadically. So these type of methods really have they're very valuable when being used with kids because they are able to capture those types of movements on a second by second basis.
mm. And how did you find, for example, there's a lot of different options where to wear the accelerometer device. How was the literature about this? I think lately we have been moving for the thigh measurement, but I think most of
Mhm.
the studies with children are either with the wrist worn or waist worn. How what was
Exactly.
said in the literature about the wearing position?
Um, for example, for adolescents, as we mentioned before, they're a little bit more picky about what they like to wear and how they like to present themselves. So they prefer the wrist to the waist because they find it less embarrassing.
Mm,
Um, and then with all of them, it sometimes overestimates it in a certain age group and underestimates it in another. So just very important there to read the literature if you are going to measure a specific age group, a specific population group, and to really go and compare the different studies out there.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's an important considerations. If you need accurate data about sedentary behavior, then I would actually advise using the thigh warm, because
Yeah.
then you actually can measure the posture, the sitting or standing, and I think that's important. Many studies are using the wrist one. It's kind of easy. People have used to it, so I think it's also a good option. I don't know. I think waist worn is probably a little bit more challenging than wrist. It's not very practical to wear it many times. How was the other objective methods? What did you learn about them writing it, and what would be recommended, what would not be recommended, and so on?
Yeah, so GPS trackers are very useful if you're interested in how kids or adolescents are commuting to school, for example. And there are actually algorithms that can automatically detect, are they walking, are they cycling, or are they taking the bus or being driven. The limitation of them is that they cannot be used indoors, so especially good
Mm,
for commutes, but not necessarily for something else. Heart rate monitors, even though they seem like a good idea, and to a certain extent they can be, they are not good at capturing the lower and upper end of intensity. And they always
mm,
require personal calibration. And then with pedometers, those used to be very popular, but they are largely being replaced nowadays by, I think, especially accelerometers.
mm. Yeah, I think heart rate monitors, they are probably a little bit challenging to use, especially with the chest belt.
Mm-hmm.
Wrist ones are a little bit easier, but you need to have it very snugly on the wrist, and wearing it longer times, kind of whole day measurements. I think it might create problems with the skin irritation. But I think
Yeah.
if you need more accurate intensity detection, especially like exercise, that what is kind of heart rate, I think it might be good to use it as a one more method. Maybe you can measure just one day, and then you know that when the kids are playing outside, you the heart rate is about this, which you might not get with the other methods. And you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
the GPS trackers, that they work quite nicely outside. Now there's a new technology which works with Bluetooth and kind of beacons, uh, Bluetooth receiver, which which can be with the accelerometer, which has a Bluetooth, that it's measuring the distance between the beacon
Mm-hmm.
and the accelerometer. I had a recording with Professor Bronwyn Clark about this, but what she had tried, I think the maturity level of technology was not yet there. It was not very good data, but I think quite soon we can actually have nice devices that can detect the distance from the beacon inside. So it could be, for example, in a school class, that you have in a certain point maybe two beacons, and then you know where the persons are in relation to that beacon. But yeah,
That's
that
exciting.
remains
Yeah.
to be seen. Do you see anything changing in the future? This is a little bit speculation, but how do you think this will be in the second edition of this ebook in some years?
I think we're just going to keep seeing improvements, especially within the field of objective methods. Um, as we kind of mentioned, for example, the heart rate monitors are good to be combined with a different type of measuring. And I think that applies to most of the methods. They all have obviously their weaknesses and strengths. So it's good to combine them. And there are nowadays also trackers that do combine different sensors. I think that's going to continue to grow and expand. And as you said, like kids are also different from adults. It's important to kind of tune into that and adapt our methods to that. And I think as we do more research, we will learn more about how. And then certainly also on the side of like data analysis, with the rise of machine learning, I think we're also going to see changes in that, hopefully better estimation of energy expenditure, posture allocation, and so on.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point you mentioned about combining different measurement methods. It might be subjective and objective, or two different objective methods, or device based. Mm-hmm. And I think now it's quite a bit that sedentary behavior and physical activity for researchers, sleep is kind of a second thought, that maybe we can measure it with this method, and they use very simple ways of measuring sleep. And then you have sleep researchers who don't know much about measurement of sedentary behavior and physical activity, and they haven't come together very closely. I think there's this need for collaboration between sleep and physical activity researchers, and they can really take advantage of each other, because it's part of 24-hour cycle, and it's important to think about the interactions. And if you sleep more, it will be replaced from something in sedentary behavior and physical activity, and vice versa. And I will be doing more episodes related to sleep research soon, that we can get actual sleep researchers to tell about studying sleep. And I think it will be interesting for many physical activity researchers.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah, and I think maybe one more future thing is that now accelerometers can be just 6 to 7 grams in weight, so they are pretty light, and most of that is battery. And the battery technology is also developing quite fast with electric cars and need for these kind of things. So I think in some years we will be probably in few grams for the device, and that's very little. And now the thickness is 4.5 millimeter, the thinnest device is. So I think in the future that you can almost integrate it into a plaster, into a patch, that you don't need actual device, but it's just in the patch. And I think that will make the measurements easier, and especially with children, because there's a little bit more problems wearing, and the devices in relation are much bigger for children than for
That's
adults.
True, yeah.
Yeah. And then there is a chapter, consumer versus research grade devices. Could you tell more about this chapter?
Yes, I can. So consumer grade devices are those that you can just get as a regular person. Fitbits, the Apple Watch, and so on. There are also nowadays some that are specially made for kids. So they have like colorful wristbands, fun designs. Often they're also quite inexpensive, or relatively inexpensive compared to other devices that you get as a researcher. So it can seem like that would be a good choice. However, especially if you're doing longitudinal studies, they are not necessarily a great choice, because these companies can change the way that the data is analyzed at any point in time and not let you know, which means that data collected at different points in time cannot be directly compared. Also, maybe you want to analyze the data a little bit differently than the company would. Also, you don't know how they're doing it, because those algorithms are proprietary. And so it is advised that if you are doing scientific research, that you get research grade devices.